Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first event on Wednesdays at the Center, Spring 2022. Wednesdays at the Center is a series hosted by the John Hope Franklin Center and Duke University Center for International and Global Studies. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Esther Kim Lee for a talk entitled Dainty as Need Be, Madam Butterfly, and Cosmetic Yellowface. Professor Kim, Dr. Esther Kim Lee is a professor in the Department of Theater Studies, the International Comparative Studies, and the Director of Asian American and Diaspora Studies at Duke University. Dr. Lee teaches and writes about theater history, Asian American theater, Korean Diaspora theater, and globalization and the theater. Dr. Lee received her Ph.D. in theater history, criticism, and literature at The Ohio State University in 2000 and taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from 2000 to 2012 and at the University of Maryland from 2013 to 2018. She is the author of A History of Asian American Theater, the Cambridge University Press 2006, which received the 2007 award for Outstanding Book given by the Association for Theater in Higher Education. She is the editor of 7 contemporary plays from the Korean Diaspora in the Americas, Duke University Press 2012. From 2013 to 2014, she was the chief editor of Theater Study, the flagship journal of the American Society for Theater Research, and served as ASTR's vice president for publications from 2017 to 2019. Her latest published book is The Theater of David Henry Hwang, Bloomsbury Methuen Drama 2015, and her new book, Made Up Asians, Yellowface During the Exclusion Era, will be published by the University of Michigan Press in 2022. So please, at this point, we're going to leave the floor to Professor Eileen Chow.
Hi, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I'm sorry, I was hopping from another Zoom meeting, but I'm so delighted to be, moderating. I guess I won't because Kevin Johnson has done such a great introduction of Esther, so I won't, but I did in my sort of poking around, was surprised to hear that Professor Lee had a BA in computer science. And I'd love to hear that reveal later. But I did just want to say that beyond the incredibly impressive publications and the way she has shaped the theater, Asian American theater studies field, and how honored we're to have her here as one of our colleagues at Duke, but also I'm personally really grateful for Esther's leadership in sort of steering Asian American diaspora studies with great efficiency and charm. And as we are sort of embarking on looking at maybe creating a minor and also building up our programming and also our structure. And so I'm just really delighted to have Esther as a colleague here, but also to recognize that this talk, I assume, is part of the project about to come out on Yellowface in the Exclusion Era, is a book I'm incredibly looking forward to. And I think that even last spring when we all did a short discussion for the campus on anti-Asian violence in the wake of the Atlanta murders, I was really impressed with how the kind of contextualization of this longer history and story of Yellowface and also particular representations of Asian American women was such an important part to understand in the here and now and for the present moment. And so I really appreciate this act of history that's also an act of intervention. Finally, I should just say that I share a lot of students with Esther, so I get to hear all the great things they say about her and also the wonderful things they bring to the classroom from her classes, and are able to continue that conversation into other classes on similar topics. And so with all that, let's welcome Professor Lee.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eileen, for the generous introduction. Also, Kevin, for the impromptu introduction that you had to do. It's such an honor to present my work to all of you today. And I want to thank the faculty and staff of APSI, especially Alex, for nominating for this really important series. And want to thank everyone at the center, Meredith, Kevin, everyone who made this event possible. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some images to show you. When you hear the word Yellowface, you may think of some caricatures of Chinese men. And they're comical, clownish, with baggy clothes, buck teeth, slanted eyes. They can be seen in 19th century stage Chinaman characters and in early film. The infamous Mr. Yonyoshi, which you see on your right, played by Mickey Rooney in Breakfast Tiffany's, is a version of this character type in the form of a Japanese man. This type of yellowface, which I call clown yellowface in my forthcoming book, can be seen in Halloween costumes, which you see on the left, and even a Snapchat filter. Here in the center is the cover of my book, and on it you see the actor Boris Karloff being made up by Cecil Holland for the role of Dr. Fu Manchu, who is perhaps the most iconic character in yellowface history. I'll be talking more about this type of yellowface and generally more about my book next Friday. So if you're interested in this topic, you could look at Franklin Humanities Institute Friday talk series, and I could share the link later as well. So for today's talk, I want to focus on different type of yellowface. So this type of yellowface does not caricature Asianness in ways that clown yellowface does. You may have seen this type of yellowface in here in Katy Perry's geisha themed performance or costumes labeled as geisha. This type of yellowface is often associated with displays of so-called the Orient, with spectacle-driven performances that feature elaborate costumes, pagodas, temples, parasols, fans, cherry blossoms. So in my talk today, I named this type of yellowface as cosmetic yellowface and trace its history to the first production of Madame Butterfly in 1900. By examining the first actress who played Cho-Cho-san, the tragic heroine of the story, I analyzed how cosmetic yellowface functioned in ways that made an indelible impact on the representation of Asian women on stage and on screen. The first actress to play Cho-Cho-san in Madame Butterfly was Blanche Bates, an American actress born in San Francisco. She was described as strikingly beautiful and athletic, with dark eyes and hair. She excelled in so-called picturesque parts, meaning that she was recognized for her appearance and physicality. When she was cast in Madame Butterfly, she was known for playing leading roles, but she was by no means a star actress. It was David Belasco, one of the most influential American directors of the time, who cast her in Madame Butterfly and made her a star. Indeed, as an influential playwright, director, and producer on Broadway, Belasco was known for creating theatrical hits and new star actors. He was famous for using the stage to create realistic and so-called naturalistic settings. He wrote and directed Madame Butterfly, A Tragedy of Japan, which was a one-act adaptation of John Luther Long's short story about a Japanese geisha who kills herself after learning that her American husband betrayed her. What's often forgotten in the history of Madame Butterfly is that when Belasco staged this play, he was taking an artistic risk. Until the opening of the play on March 5th, 1900 at the Herald Square Theater in New York City, plays and musicals about Japan were typically associated with comic musicals in the style of the Mikado, which in the image you see here. These types of musicals caricatured Japanese characters and were set in fantastical versions of Japan. Belasco's Madame Butterfly, however, was not a comedy or a musical. The play was the first attempt by an American playwright to tell a serious story about Japan with a caricature. And the play's setting emulated Japanese paintings that were often erotic and featured idyllic places occupied by beautiful women in kimonos surrounded by blossoming cherry trees. It was with this vision of the play that Blanche Bates was cast to star in the play and to portray the tragic Japanese woman. Velasco's experiment paid off, and the production of Madame Butterfly was a huge hit. And the critics, and many critics, praised the serious and tragic beauty it portrayed. Velasco was a leading innovator of American realism in the early 20th century and was known for using cutting-edge technology to create detailed and spectacular sets. He presented the play in a style of what I call hyper-realism by transforming the entire stage into a Japanese house. Before the 20th century, theater scenery typically consisted of poorly lit stock sets. The style of acting emphasized the actor's voice and what we call declamation, which is kind of projecting really loudly to audience, which is not the way real people talk. With the advent of new technology in theater, especially the use of electric lighting, the entire stage became a three-dimensional canvas for directors to fill. Production photos of Madame Butterfly show the significant detail Velasco used to create something audiences would recognize or what they imagined to be actual Japanese house or one they saw in paintings. The image Japan idolized in the play was that of so-called old Japan, and it was praised as a triumph of beauty and master of atmospheric detail, according to one critic. Velasco controlled and dictated every detail of the production, including the actors and their acting style. Indeed, actors were an important part of the overall design. These qualities aligned with what Velasco wanted for the role of Cho-Cho-san. In the play, the Japanese geisha speaks little and uses gestures such as bowing to communicate her thoughts and feelings. For example, when she learns that her American husband, Lieutenant Pinkerton, inquired about her in a letter to the American consul, it is her physical reaction and not what she says that reveals her state of mind. In one scene, she receives a letter and the stage direction describes her as being, quote, convulsed with silent joy, end quote. This photograph is of that scene, illustrates how Bates looked. She's on her knees, bowing and holding a fan, with her head tilted and the eyes cast down. She's indeed picturesque in Velasco's carefully staged mise-en-scène, a transposition of the version of Japan he had researched and read about in books. He was replicating what he saw in the art books on the three-dimensional stage. Velasco was not interested in staging an actual Japanese house and preferred to present the version he depicted in artworks and fictional stories. He made many choices that departed from traditional Japanese customs, emphasizing the creation of a particular atmosphere over authenticity. For example, as the photograph shows, he had cherry blossom petals scattered all over the stage, which was intended to represent the inside of Cho-Cho-san's house. I'm sure all of you know, in real Japanese home, the maid who stands behind Cho-Cho-san in the photograph would have been busy sweeping the petals away. A separation between indoors and outdoors is imperative in Japan. This is one example of how Velasco's Madame Butterfly presented an image, imagined Japan based on paintings, books, and fictional stories. In other words, he used hyper-realism to stage and imagine Japan. But Blanche Bates' portrayal of Cho-Cho-san also purported to be realistic while also being based on an imagined Japan. Bates had the task of transforming her appearance, movement, and speech so as to portray a tragic Japanese woman whose pathos enhanced the beauty of the story. Luckily, Bates had a unique opportunity when preparing for the role. While she was rehearsing the play, Sada Yako, a Japanese geisha, actress, and dancer, was in New York City for 10 evenings to perform with a touring group led by her husband, Otojiro Kawakami. Bates wanted to learn to, quote, walk and talk like a Japanese woman, end quote, and observe Yako for a week to study her closely. Bates imitated Yako as closely as possible and later joked that she had difficulty, quote, tying on funny little Japanese clothes, end quote, and learning to sit on her knees. Yako had performed in San Francisco, Chicago, and other major cities before arriving in New York. She was set to embark on a European tour from which she would emerge as an international star. Artists such as Degas, Rodin became her fans, and she was sketched by Picasso. Puccini was inspired to write the opera version of Madame Butterfly based on her performance. In addition to being a famous geisha, she was the first modern actress. She was called Japanese Ellen Terry or Japanese Sarah Bernhardt, invoking two of the most celebrated contemporary actresses in European theater. She arrived in the US at a time when Japanese fashion, decor was the latest trend among white American women, inspiring some to don kimonos, collect Japanese art, purchase craft made in Japan. Japanese commodities were assumed to cater to so-called feminine taste of white American women. And Japanese culture was associated with terms such as orderliness, purity, and fragility. Japanese fashion also gave white women a sense of liberation from Victorian era restrictions that helped them feel like modern women. It is unknown whether Yako actually taught Bates or how much the latter was able to learn in a single week of observation, but Madame Butterfly opened only 5 days after the Japanese troupe began its run at the Berkeley Lyceum on West 44th Street, inevitably inviting comparisons. Edward Dithmar, a critic for New York Times, reviewed the two actresses side by side in an article. He was not, however, interested, this I found very interesting when reading his article, he did not compare the two actresses directly, or he was not interested in assessing how well Bates imitated a Japanese woman. Rather, he praised Bates for her performance of Cho-Cho-san by highlighting her acting skills and her ability to capture the pathos of the character. And also, he emphasized that Cho-Cho-san was a fictional character and not representative of real Japanese women, and noted the difference between the actress and the character. So let me quote the critics, a little long, but I think the comparing what he said about the two actresses is kind of key to my argument. So I'll give you this whole passage. So this is what he said. As to whether or not Bates' portrayal is Japanese, there need no dispute. People who know Japan well will tell you that Long's own Madame Butterfly is not Japanese, that women do cherish sentimental ideals, which in this context means kind of moral ideals in that country. But Miss Bates' portrayal is human, and its imitation of Japanese manners and characteristics is facile. She's tall for a musume, but she's dainty as need be in every gesture and movement. Her delivery of Mr. Long's curious patois is exceedingly interesting, and the lighter moods of the heroine are expressed as clearly and pleasingly as her sorrow and bitter resolve are indicated truthfully and powerfully. There can be no two sane opinions of the power imposed of Miss Bates' acting in that scene or of the pathos of her representation of Cho-Cho-san's death. Dithmar explicitly states that Bates was too tall to look like musume, which is, I'm not pronouncing it in a French way, I'm probably butchering it, is a petite Japanese woman, but finds her gestures and movements dainty as need be. She could never look completely like a Japanese woman, but she embodied the fictional character in a way that was truthful and powerful. Now, if you compare this to what he said about Yako, he describes this actress as a little geisha girl and surprisingly human. This is what he says. The little geisha girl is surprisingly human, and her fury when she's roused by jealousy is so fiercely savage that all preconceived ideas of the manners, expressions, and feelings of the Japanese woman are entirely overthrown. It is difficult to think of a Japanese woman of any age, rank, or character as anything but pretty, dainty little creature sitting in her toy house, arranging a little branch of cherry blossoms, or amusing herself in a miniature garden. No one would have expected to find an emotional actress in Japan, but who would have expected to find an emotional woman there? Dithmar's comparison, though it's indirect, casts the two performers as opposite. Bates is praised as powerful actress who can express what Dithmar implies a universal human pathos. And the fact that her character is Japanese is nearly beside the point. On the other hand, Yako is seen primarily as Japanese actress whose performance of basic human emotions, such as fear, is unexpected and surprising. Unlike the white woman whose humanity is presumed, the Japanese woman is seen as merely, quote, pretty little creature sitting in her toy house. This comparison between Bates and Yako reveals the core feature of what I call cosmetic yellowface, which I define as a formal racial impersonation of East Asian characters that relies on generally enhancing a performance appearance to render their portrayal more effective. Cosmetic yellowface uses makeup, costume, accessories, and gestures, though not in ways that caricature the physiognomic features of East Asian. Instead, its function is to make performers look attractive, albeit in exotic ways, and to showcase their humanity, versatility, and effectiveness. What is missing in this Mars review is the fact that Yako was a modern actress who was performing in a new form of theater. He completely ignores her artistry and expertise and treats her as if she's herself on display in an ethological way. The theatrical style performed by Yako's troupe was Soshei Shibai, or new theater, which was part of Shinpa, the first Japanese modern theater that included what some people call pastiche of kabuki, and other scholars call it kind of, it pandered to Western audiences hungry for anything Japanese. Soshei Shibai was considered an avant-garde form of art and subversive in its experimental approach. In other words, what Yako embodied and performed was not traditional Japanese theater like No or Kabuki, which did not allow women to perform, but what many traditionalists in Japan consider to be crudely westernized and melodramatic. But to American audiences, Yako's appearance and performance were consistent with the understanding of Japan that gained from imported goods, artworks, exhibitions, and tea gardens. During her tour in the West, her most famous act was that of a death scene, and known as dojoji, a dance that tells the story of a young woman who is rejected by a celibate priest and in anger turns into a fire-breathing serpent. The dance was in effect a type of strip show in which the dancer begins with multiple layers kimono, which is taken off one by one to symbolize the serpent shedding its skin. The truthful act included comedy, acrobats, but what audiences wanted in the US was to see Yako and her death scene. Ironically, she had wanted to avoid looking ghastly and too deadly to Western audiences and did not use this kind of very white makeup that was traditional for geishas and female characters in Japanese theater. Instead, she opted for what she described as much lighter, more natural makeup. She wanted to be seen as a strong modern woman, but newspaper and magazine articles devoted significant space to her delicate appearance. One article described her as most notable because of her Oriental beauty. So this is pretty typical of how her face was described. She's Japan's greatest geisha and a perfect type of Oriental beauty, showing the fine, long oval face with prominent, well-chiseled features, deep sunken eye sockets, oblique eyes, long drooping eyelids, elevated and arched eyebrows, high and narrow forehead, rounded nose, a bud-like mouth, pointed chin, small hands, feet. Such features in fine as belonging to the Japanese ideals of physical perfection. Every newspaper article about her performance during her American tours was filled with such colorful descriptives such as sweet doll-like beauty, delicious appearance. And her death scene, the finale of the evening's performance, was the most impressive expression of a delicate beauty bound up with the emotionally powerful death scene that made her a star. But it must be remembered that in 1900, in the US, Asian women, real Asian women, were excluded from immigration naturalization and labeled as immoral and undesirable. Traveling actresses like Yako may have been embraced as celebrities, but immigrants who wished to stay in the country were generally unwelcome. For example, the Page Act of 1875 banned the immigration of Asian women for so-called lewd and immoral purposes from China, Japan, or any Oriental country. That's how the law articulated it. Under the presupposition that most of them were prostitutes or second wives in polygamous marriages. Because Chinese men were not allowed to immigrate during the exclusion era, Chinese women were by default regarded as outside the category of wives, and the burden of proof was on the women to establish that they were morally upright. The 1891 Immigration Act excluded women suspected of so-called sexual misdeeds, and the 1903 Immigration Act excluded prostitutes from all countries, but it was intended to target Asians. And quote, any unaccompanied women of any age, marital status, or background, end quote, was questioned to be a potential public charge. So-called Japanese picture brides would begin to arrive in the US starting around 1908, but even then they were severely restricted and faced discriminatory laws, such as the California's Alien Land Law, which prevented, quote, aliens ineligible to citizenship, which meant Asian immigrants, from owning land. While real Japanese women were excluded and suspected of being sexually immoral, fictional Asian women characters are portrayed as exotically sexual and were performed by some of the most popular and respected actresses of the era. Excuse me. White actresses playing sexualized Asian women in Yellowface were admired on stage and on the screen, but real Asian women were excluded from immigration and citizenship because of the potential danger their sexuality posed to society. It was in this historical context that the tragedy of Japanese, and by extension, Asian women, was represented as theatrical and beautiful. And the tragic Asian character type was favored by many white actresses who wanted to demonstrate their acting versatility. They changed their faces with makeup to look sufficiently Asian or dainty enough while maintaining their white beauty. They carefully choreographed their gestures in imitation of doll-like Japanese or Asian women. In short, the tragedy of the Asian women could be a means of showcasing what the white actress could do. Every time their characters died, the performance evoked the symbolic exclusion of Asian women and showcased their prowess as actresses. The tragic Asian character type was in many ways the ideal vehicle for the white actress to showcase the depth and breadth of their emotional range and tragic pathos, because white women and Asian women are often viewed as opposites. And Blanche Bates, like many white actresses, wanted to take advantage of the tragic Asian character to further her career. Ultimately, her performances became a prototype for white actresses who used cosmetic yellowface to portray Asian characters throughout the 20th century. White actresses impersonated Asian women in order to demonstrate their acting skills and to boost their popularity by highlighting the difference between the Asian femininity they perform and the white womanhood they projected off stage. When, for instance, Bates jokingly complained about, quote, tying on funny little Japanese clothes and learned to sit like a geisha, she was in fact emphasizing how the Japanese character was fundamentally different from who she was as a white woman. She was implicitly asking the audience to acknowledge how she, the tall white actress, excelled at performing a character who was so different from her. Bates' transformation into a Japanese woman allowed her to showcase her talent and to become a star actress in a society that idolized white celebrities. At the turn of the 20th century, white womanhood was not a stable identity in the US, and actresses, many of whom had poor immigrant backgrounds, had to perform a certain kind of whiteness to further their careers. For actresses to become stars, they had to project an image of the so-called new woman, who was more modern, more energetic, far less deferential, modest in the era's exceedingly visual culture. The actress had to have marketability and sex appeal while also embodying independence and professionalism. And those who looked like, quote, models of Anglo-Saxon gentility and femininity, unquote, had an advantage in their path towards stardom. Thus, white actresses performing Asian characters had to embody not only Asian femininity, but also all the while representing the new woman and promoting Anglo-Saxon standards of whiteness. She had to perform both Asianness and whiteness. To this end, white actresses used both cosmetic yellowface, which relied on theatrical makeup to create Asian facial features, and cosmetic makeup that enhanced their beauty as white women. The success of Madame Butterfly inspired Velasco to produce another play about Japan titled The Darling of Gods. This is a full-length play, and once again starred Bates as a Japanese princess and a tragic heroine. Although today the play is less known than Madame Butterfly, The Darling of the Gods had a much longer run and received significantly more publicity when it was produced. After a successful run on Broadway, it went on a national tour for 3 years. Bates performed her tragic Japanese heroine in Chicago, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, and also you see here the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. During her tour, she gave numerous interviews to explain how she prepared for the role and what it was like to portray a Japanese woman. Bates' makeup technique was of intense interest to her fans, and articles about her transformation were published in newspapers and magazines alongside close-up photographs and the actress as Yo-san, the character in the play. In the photograph, she looks to be made up with lighter brown grease paint than that were worn by men portraying Japanese characters. Her eyes and eyebrows are drawn with black eyeliners angled upward. Her lips are also shaped to make them look smaller. In an article titled How a Yankee Girl Becomes a Japanese, and I apologize for the quality of this photo, this is the best I could find. For instance, there are 3 photographs of Bates accompanying a detailed description of transformation from, they quote, the American actress, to quote, Yo-san, the dainty little lady of the flowery kingdom. The first photograph shows Bates before donning her makeup on your left, and while the other 2 feature her in Japanese makeup, juxtaposed next to the first photograph to illustrate the vast contrast between them. Reaching during the performance of The Darling of the Gods in Boston, there's a long description of Bates' transformation in what the article I'll be sharing with you. And it's worth citing it here, and it's quite long, but again, I think it's really great to listen to how her performance and how her preparation was described, at least in this particular article. So the article describes the actress in a dressing room at the Tremont Theater in Boston and goes into detail about how Bates dons a kimono, which was imported by Velasco from Japan, and begins to look like a veritable Japanese. So the article reads, clothes in Japanese style from head to foot, Miss Bates is ready for the most exacting part of her task. So carefully indeed, her headdress, facial makeup are prepared that she's obliged to be at the theater over an hour before the curtain rises. And this is how the room was described. The making up of the face for any stage character requires both time and patience, but the preparation for a Japanese part needs to be especially skillful and in every way artistic. The entire contour, expression of the face must be compelled by all the sources of the makeup to take on those characteristics which are peculiar to Japanese. To do this, Miss Bates first of all deepens her complexion to the requisite Japanese hue, and then by clever manipulation of the eyebrow, she gives to her eyes that narrow look, upward tilt, without which no Oriental can be himself or herself. She first covers her own eyebrows with flesh-colored grease paint, and then by means of a pencil especially made for the purpose, she replaces them with thick black and slanting eye, which at a short distance looks exactly like the Japanese eyebrow. This accomplishes the wonders, and already Miss Bates has begun to look like a veritable Japanese. After that comes the headdress with this rolls of coarse black hair, and then Miss Bates is ready to step upon the stage, the actual embodiment of the romantic Yo-san. After describing Bates' makeup and costume, the article continues with description of her physicality and movement. Emphasizing her athleticism as supple and muscular, the article praises Bates for dedicating herself to the strict training necessary to accomplish the difficult task. So this is a description of her physicality. Throughout the whole of the play, she walks with the absurd waddle of the Oriental. For although the Japanese do not bind the feet of their infant girls, they nevertheless step with mincing gait entirely unlike even the most modest stride of an American woman. Bates's athletic exercises have enabled her to kneel without difficulty on cushions or squat on the floor, her every posture and movement conforming to rigid Japanese custom. And as for her speech, she's described as talking in, quote, a quick, halting, rhythmic manner, which suggests the peculiarities of the Japanese speech, end quote. Her transformation, in short, was multifaceted and involved all aspects of acting, using her speech pattern, movement, makeup, and costume. She convinced her audience to suspend their disbelief and to imagine her as a Japanese princess. Japan, like the rest of Asia, was seen as profoundly different from the West, and what Bates accomplished in her costume and performance was praised as extraordinary. As Marie Yoshihara explains, quote, Bates appears to conquer the wide gap which the audience believed existed between white middle-class womanhood and Japanese femininity, end quote. By conquering the gap, Bates demonstrated her versatility as an actress. For white actresses, it was imperative to make the gap between self and character as conspicuous as possible. It was not only that she would be praised for her acting range by taking Asian roles, it was important for her to remind the audience that she was a beautiful white woman beneath the yellow-face makeup. This type of makeup Bates wore to play Yo-san would come to be known as the geisha in makeup books, despite the fact that the character Yo-san is a princess. It was based on an imitation of Yako, who had previously imitated Western women by toning down the whiteness of traditional geisha makeup. The so-called geisha makeup became a popular method of depicting Japanese female characters throughout the 20th century. Makeup books published a couple of decades into the 20th century, this is from the 1960s, describe how the makeup for Japanese women should feature mouths that are, quote, reduced to the tiniest size possible, end quote, and with eyes with slanting lines. The makeup technique for Japanese female characters was frequently described in terms of geisha makeup and was not uncommon to see Japanese women described interchangeably with the geisha. The real tragedy of Asian women in the US was downplayed or ignored, while the romanticized deaths of fictional Asian women became the primary trope used to represent Asian womanhood. But the more lasting legacy of Cosmetic Yellowface was how it operated to exclude Asian American actresses from being cast in principal roles in theater and film. For example, the Chinese American actress Anna May Hwang, which is on your left, was US born and celebrated as an all-American flapper girl. But she was told that she could not be cast in the starring role of the Good Earth. The role of Olan instead went to Louis Rainer, which you see here on your right, who was born in Germany. Indeed, all lead roles in the film were played by white actors in Yellowface. When Irving Thalberg, the film's producer, explained why he cast the film set in China with white actors in lead roles, he stated, "I'm in the business of creating illusions." He believed that the audience would suspend their disbelief and willingly accept as Chinese white actors in makeup. Indeed, Rainer in Cosmetic Yellowface was convincing enough to win an Academy Award for Best Actress, while Hwang was explicitly excluded from the industry that saw her foremost as Chinese and not as a serious actress. Hwang was called a China doll with, quote, an almond-shaped, unfathomable eyes with a calm depth of Orient in them, end quote. She not only had to perform what she described as 1,000 deaths that symbolically excluded Asian women, but also experienced exclusion from her profession because of her Asian female identity. In reviewing The Good Earth, Frank Nugent of New York Times praised Rainer for her, quote, tragically real performance and for, quote, bringing to life the pathetic slave girl who was so modest yet so indomitable, so generous and selfless and loyal, end quote. So once again, the tragedy of an Asian woman was cited to highlight the virtuosity of a white actress, and Rainer's Cosmetic Yellowface was used, as it was for Bates, to make her a star. Notably, Rainer did not want to alter her eyes with prosthetics, which were available in the 1930s to portray Olan. She wanted to evoke a Chinese peasant woman while ensuring she still looked like an attractive white woman. Other white actors playing Chinese characters had their eyes transformed, which you see on her husband character on the photo, with prosthetic technology. Like Bates, Rayner did not have to drastically transform her face to look sufficiently Asian or dainty as needs be. By looking cosmetically Asian to their audiences, both were allowed to showcase their versatility and prowess as actresses, while representing the tragic beauty and symbolic exclusion of Asian women. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Esther. We have a little bit of time, so I didn't know, I mean, what a rich talk and just amazing images. And I was wondering if we should just open the floor to questions, and if people wish to put it in chat or perhaps raise their hand. I think we're intimate enough that we probably could do that. So.
I had one question, Eileen.
Please.
What was in one of the posters, there was a SWAT sticker on the bottom left hand. What was going on there? It was a red.
That's not a swastika. Actually, there's an answer in the chat box. It's actually a symbol, religious symbol for many Asian religions. It's like, it's actually reversed, opposite. Yeah.
Okay.
My video is going to be good. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. So I guess I have several questions. Because you bring up a topic that I just saw a movie called The Unforgivable with Burt Lancaster and Audrey Hepburn, and she plays a Kiowa Native American. And then I'm also thinking about Nicole Kidman's portrayal of Lucille Ball, which is not, not the racial aspect, but still, I think these actresses, like you mentioned, they're looking for something off the beaten path that they can really show their chops. And then I'm also trying to figure out where the fact that women couldn't be actresses in many of these cultures. And so you had men, and then the masks come, I believe, because, you have to have, I don't know, it's just this sort of like this creation of the theater itself. And, but my main question, actually, so you've made a lot of thoughts, which I think is, I'm trying to say as a compliment. Like, that's what I love about these things, is you make me think about different things. But my main question is, so I'm more of an opera fan, and I've never seen the play. I know about it from the opera, but I think her name's Shosho. I can't now remember the main character.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good. She's, supposed to be 15 years old. And I wonder, is that, and I did just read on Wikipedia, like the original book, she tries to commit suicide, but she doesn't actually go through with it. But is that also a recurring characteristic of the stereotyping, is that not only are they, women of a certain like nubile beauty, but they're actually very, very young, as it explicitly talks about in the opera, that he's, I don't know, there's all sorts of, in the libretto, there's all sorts of references to this older man. It's a metaphor for colonization, I guess. So, it goes into like, it's very explicit, like he's dominating. I can't think of the actual words, but, he's doing this to a younger woman, not just a woman, but a younger woman. But,
yeah, I mean, the opera is really interesting, and because if you look at the genealogy, Madame Butterfly, it actually is it comes from a French story. It's like a travel story by some French naval officer who actually had a real relationship with a geisha, and they had a contractual marriage. that marriage just they kind of agree to end it, and she vows she doesn't die, and they go off separate ways. It was like this kind of like, this erotic story. But then that was adapted by Long as kind of a short story in which there's like death is introduced, and then it becomes a play in which the death is made this kind of aesthetic thing, right? Which I talked about. The opera, if you look at the opera, its entire thing is about death, right? Like the climatic aria is the death. So it's interesting how the death of this woman, like you said, there are many elements, like her age, like her class, all the things are all there. But what we remember of, especially the opera, is the death scene, where, it's just a glorification of this gruesome death that she basically cuts her throat with her father's sword. And that just made into something that's beautiful, and people just cry and they're so deeply moved by it. So that's something bizarre, that somehow there's a little bit of like fetishization of the death of this character that I do see, kind of this genealogy of the opera. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing that I've always, and this is interesting in relation to Yellowface too. Of course, the Anime Hwang early film Toll of the Sea, right, which is the kind of moving Hollywood rendition of Madame Butterfly that is set in Canton and made into a Chinese story, and but was done precisely to showcase. It was the first kind of color film that showcased white and yellow complexion. So they wanted an interracial romance that had the gradations. That was how it was advertised. But then again, the death becomes a central plot point, right, to an Anime Hwang's death at the end. But I see that there is another question, and I was really, about sort of perhaps acceptability. Like I was actually thinking a little bit, maybe reframing that question that Mike Liverite has posted, is I don't think there's obviously a yes, no answer, but I do wonder, Esther, in thinking about contemporary productions, what is a possible, how does one honor the context and history of what you just presented to us? Like, how does one kind of approach that as someone who is staging a contemporary version of one of these historically problematic plays? Or maybe the answer is to kind of set them aside for a bit. I was kind of curious about that.
Well, I'm a theater historian, so it has to be all historically contextual. So right. In the context of this acting history that I described today, I don't think there's an acceptable way for a non-Asian actor to play Asian roles. I think Hollywood finally realizes this. I think one way would be to do it ironically. I mean, that's in a way to kind of it's like subvert the portrayal while portraying it. That it's possible to do that. This is a question about casting, and this is what I found really interesting in my research, is that whenever we talk about Yellowface, we go immediately to casting. But casting does not become an issue until like the 1960s, when Asian Americans now protest and they insist that they be also cast in these roles. But what I found out, like during my research, is that casting is a symptom, not the cause of Yellowface. Casting, I mean, I'm trying to get to the core like issue of what Yellowface is, not to talk about how it's manifest. So yeah, we could talk about casting a lot. I mean, I've written about Miss Saigon controversy, all this stuff, but I'm actually more interested in what is it about the kind of the history of this Yellowface that has made it difficult and sometimes impossible to have Asian actors play Asian roles. Right? I mean, it's about the industry, the history of the industry. So I'm not like avoiding the question. I'm trying to kind of shift the focus, because there's so much discussion about casting, and I don't think that's helpful in a way, because I think we don't get to the kind of core, the crux of the problem right. that I'm trying to identify.
Thank you.
I'm seeing another question about, there's Emily. No.
Yeah, sorry, I finally got it. I think it to work, if you can hear me. So I was really interested in this, both because I actually saw the play in Brightleaf outside here in Durham, I think in the maybe 80s or 90s. And also the term cosmetic yellowface was one that was newer to me. And I had a question kind of related to the way that you described it in the presentation. I think the term that I'm more familiar with is blackface, which is similarly the idea of using makeup. But the way you described cosmetic yellowface, I found really interesting that it incorporated more than changing your face with makeup, but all the dress, the scenery, like you described the petals inside of a house. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit maybe about that that term and the difference of if there is a term just yellowface without cosmetic in front of it. I'm not sure I hope this makes sense as a question.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think that's really the point I'm trying to make. I mean, cosmic yellowface is a term I coined, so you're hearing it for the first time. The book's not out yet, so you're a privileged audience. So yeah, it is a term I had to come up with because the term yellowface was not enough to describe different variations of yellowface. So the kind of typical yellowface we think about, like I began with the images of the Chinese characters, Chinese male characters. That's similar to blackface in that they both from comic performance background, vaudeville, minstrelsy. That it has a same root in this kind of really, and then also yellowface in that sense was much darker than cosmic yellowface. So the comparisons can be made between those kind of yellowface, what we call stage Chinaman, and then the blackface. But cosmic yellowface, as I talked about, is very different. It's different. It's not to caricatures. It doesn't come from vaudeville or minstrelsy. It comes from what we call legitimate Broadway theater for elite audiences. So it's a term that I coined to make that distinction.
That's great. I think I see another hand up.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Cheng-yin? Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really excited to read your book, and you've just been addressing a lot of things I've been thinking about a lot. And I was also particularly struck by your term, cosmetic yellowface, and how we need nuance to describe these different types. And you've gestured to this kind of throughout your talk, but I was wondering if you could talk more about the connections between capital and cosmetic yellowface, because a lot of it seems to also be really tied into marketing, as you were demonstrating with the magazines.
Oh yeah. Thank you for that question. In my longer chapter, I do go into history of cosmetics and how in cosmetic history in Europe particularly, we're always tied to the Orient. So when you look at these makeup, old makeup, eyeliners or rouges, they often had like these exotic Asian names. So like the eyeliner was called Indian ink, for example. And yeah, it was used as marketing. And there's a long history to this. And it really goes back to the beginning of colonialism, in which these kind of imported products from so-called the Orient were marketed as somehow more pure. And in a way, it's consistent with what I'm arguing with cosmic yellowface. It was like, these Asian women wear this makeup, they're beautiful, look how pure and beautiful they are. But if white women wore it, you'd be even more beautiful because you're superior, racially. So it was way too marked, and a lot of French companies did it. And if you look at if you go to eBay, sometimes you could find this. If you look at old makeup box, they're called Chinese box. They're literally called Chinese box. So there are these kind of association with the Orient, and then of course marketing. And yes, in these magazines that like Bates' interview was quoted in, next to it, you will see makeup products being sold to enhance your beauty. Yeah.
That's great. Our hour is almost up, but I wondered I don't know if Esther wants to take a final question, or anybody has I see that Renata has also asked a question on chat.
I think we could end with Renata's question. This is really important because this is what really began my project, helped me begin my project, which was like, why has it persisted? This persistence of yellowface. And this is a question that, that I've been trying to answer. And it really comes down to, I think ultimately what my book argues is that the yellowface history is really not about Asian characters or about Asians at all. It's really about the rise of the white acting industry So this exclusion era coincides with this rise of so-called the white actor. And as long as that kind of this almost like I see it like as a caste system, this hierarchy of actors in terms of their physical appearance and all that and connections, as long as that doesn't go away, this type of performance will persist. So that's a structural thing that I have come to conclusion. So as long as studio executives in Hollywood think that there's money to be made with Scarlett Johansson playing a Japanese character, yeah, she'll be cast. It really comes down to money and box office in that logic of the acting industry. So this is why the casting question is so much more complex, and that hopefully we'll have another chance to talk about that. But for now, that's a short answer to Renata. I don't know if that's satisfying, but that's my take on your question.
I also think it extends in a really interesting way back to Raymond's question earlier about that, as you point out, that the hierarchy of white acting is also that inhabiting other people's skin is seen as something we reward with awards. So, so that it becomes also this kind of award system of, this is how you become a true actor, is to pretend to be another ethnicity, right?
Exactly. And often it was a kind of test case, especially actors who are not read as white. They would perform these non-white characters, and they would win Academy Awards for doing that. Right. So it was a really great kind of vehicle and technology, I think, a way to kind of go up the hierarchy in the acting industry.
Yeah. But great. Thank you so much, Esther. That was just so rich and so fascinating. And we all look forward to the book, I'm sure. So
yeah, and come to the Friday Talk next week. I put in the chat the link to the registration. So thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, this was a fantastic topic, something I was very interested in, and it was very interesting. So I want to thank you, Professor Kim, and you, Professor Chow, and thank everyone who's attended today at Wednesdays at the Center. So next week at Wednesdays at the Center continues with Bruce Lawrence, Emeritus Professor of Islamic Studies here at Duke University, who will present his book, Islamicate, Cosmopolitan Spirit. So again, thank you all again to our first event in 2022. And we hope to see you again next Wednesday, February 2nd. Have a great day, everyone, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.